You were at Big Four as well.
I was, I was at PwC for PwC. So I was at a firm in Sydney, and it got bought by PwC during that period when the Big Four were buying up law firms. I was Exhibit A. They bought me and my firm. Not just me. They bought a firm of like 300 people, and that drew me into PwC, and then I ended up in London.
How did you end up in London? Just because of this acquisition?
Yes and no. Although I grew up in Australia, my parents are both English, and when my wife and I, who you met, got married in '91, we came over to the UK. We stayed in the UK until '98, and then the question is, Yanis, as you will know, where do you put the kids into school? So we went back to Australia, and I joined a firm in Australia in '98, and then another one in '99, and then it got bought by PwC. And then someone said, we need someone in London doing litigation. You can go. So back I came, and it was obviously great for me.
So you moved with your family or just alone?
Sure. It was all of us came over, and started at PwC in London in when it would have been about October 2000, and then the Hearst case came out in March 2001, and that's when all the work really started. And for us, it was that decision which was really big for the UK market. It really drew it to everyone's attention, the impact of EU law on the UK tax system. Before then, people had just thought, it was a problem for other people. It didn't really have an impact on the UK. There'd been Daily Mail had been, when was that, about 1988. So that was a UK case, but the UK had actually won that case. Then there was ICI and Colmer, which when was ICI and Colmer? About 1996, 97. That had such a limited impact. So it only really related to how you regarded a group for the relief of UK profits and losses against each other. It didn't really expand it. So it was really a sort of intra-UK issue, and the government then legislated quite soon afterwards to change the law. So, and then Hearst came out in March 2001, and it really did take off, and that's where I was sitting at the time in the tax department of the biggest of the Big Four in London, with all of these clients who were thinking, what do we do now? And so all the claims sort of came from there.
Right. But despite that, you left PwC some 20 years ago for was it Dorsey and Whitney? So
where have you got this from, Yanis? You are absolutely right. So what happened then? You were at the Big Four, were you, at some stage?
I was KPMG.
Yeah, I thought
right.
so. I thought so.
I left because of Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
That's exactly the same thing. So the Big Four, or back in those days it was the Big Five, wasn't it? Because there was Anderson was still around, and Deloitte hadn't developed a legal arm, but the others had, and they were getting fairly big. And this was obviously an area of considerable utility for Big Four firms that had legal arms, because you could bring now legal cases to recover taxes, and you had the clients, the clients, you were providing audit and tax services. So you knew the clients who were impacted by these ideas that were coming out. And yes, and then you had the facility to run them through the law firm. And I was in the law firm. So, and then Sarbanes-Oxley happened. Well, then I suppose we should say it was WorldCom and Enron that happened. And that was, when was that? That was sort of end of 2002, wasn't it? Sort of June, July 2002. They broke. And then there was also Tyco at about the same time. All of them attached to Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen then, it was very, you'll recall, it was really very speedy how it closed down, Arthur Andersen. It was sort of like, it wasn't quite overnight, but it was pretty quick. Right. And then Sarbanes-Oxley said you can't do litigation services, so you can't advocate in a court on behalf of an audit client. PwC, they worked out that 90% of my clients were PwC audit clients. So PwC made it was PwC that moved me. They saw that this was a service they were supplying to their clients. They couldn't do it themselves. So they made a decision really early that an orderly exit was in order. So that's when I went over to Dorsey and Whitney with the whole team. We all went. It was it was a TUPE transfer. So PwC were, it was a home that everyone liked. That was so it was Sarbanes-Oxley that caused me to leave the Big Four. So wasn't driven by me, but I'm very happy with the home I landed in. Right.
And I was surprised to see that actually you have PhD. So basically it means history and philosophy is in your heart. So what's the story behind that? Is that some sideline in addition to being a lawyer?
I often speak at these conferences, as indeed do you, Yanis, and that's where we've met in Berlin. And I'll be standing around a group of guys, and they'll be talking about their PhDs, which are all in things like international tax or double tax conventions and stuff like that. Yeah, mine is in Latin adjectives, and in fact, it's in epithets used by Cicero. So it's not even as broad and useful as adjectives. And I'm very happy to tell you more about it. But
please do.
I know but yes, I did that. So I'm also older than you, which means I went through university when university was free in Australia. And no fees. So I did, so after I got my law degree, I also did an arts degree as well at the same time. And after I got my honours, I got a grant. I was eligible for a grant to do a PhD because I got the marks, and I had an idea, which was this idea about Cicero. So I thought, at the age, when would I have been? I started that when I was 24. So I thought, if I don't do it now, something's going to happen and I'll never do it again. So I did that. I worked part-time in a law firm and did my PhD back then, which I have never used since.
But why such a choice, Cicero?
Oh, because I thought I had an idea that other people hadn't thought of, and when you're 24, you can be a bit on the arrogant side, mate, especially if you're an Australian lawyer. And I just thought I had an idea, and it was worth developing. And I got a grant for it. I went back in 2015 to the funeral of my old supervisor who for the PhD, and there were all of his subsequent students. I was his very first PhD student, and he had the other ones were there at the funeral. And I told them that about this grant I'd got and how much money it was, and how, you know, for a young kid living on the beaches of Sydney, surfing in the morning, you know, it was a nice sum of money to have. And there was general silence until one of them said, Simon, that grant you got back in 1986 is the same grant we have, and it hasn't gone up in value since then. So I was lucky. They invested in higher education back then, and for some reason, someone thought that studying adjectives in Cicero was somehow worthwhile to the economy of Australia.
Has it helped somehow in your career as a solicitor?
Oh, I don't know. Well, you know, as you know, in one sense, tertiary education is always helpful in everything. You know, and frankly, it wasn't the PhD because but it's my education generally is basically the asset I've sold for the rest of my life in one way or another, as do we all, mate. So it's not irrelevant, but yeah, and I'm happy to say that no one has subsequently come up with the same idea, and I read my old PhD over summer, and although I'd changed the style a bit now, I do think it's still right.
Right. One of my teachers at the university, one of the professors, just passed away a couple of weeks ago, and because of that, I started to. He was teaching Roman law,
Yeah.
and because of that, I picked up my Roman law books and
Okay.
and faced some stories about Cicero, and
Okay.
one of his of course one of his most famous expressions was laws are silent in time of war. Uh, so we can see
Well,
now that
certainly they were with him, weren't they? It was Buckland, one of the books you read? Buckland textbook of.
no, not really, no.
Okay, all right. Well, that was our one. Yeah, the what I found really interesting about that early period, particularly in the Republic, is how the older the system is not the less developed it is, it's the more formal it gets. It gets more and more formal. So if you start with a legal system that has and early legal systems are obviously all religion-based. They always have a spiritual basis to them. And with Rome, it was, of course, the 12 tables, and they were from the gods. You know, they were of that nature. So all of the development of law after that, especially in the Republic, is all trying to fit within the precepts of the 12 tables, going back, and they were from, I don't know, 800 BC or something, or that's certainly when the Romans like to date it. And they're all trying to fit it within them. And as your economy gets more developed, life actually becomes more complicated. You start forming companies. You start buying and selling commodities. You start forward buying and short selling. They were doing all of these things, and you're trying to fit it into a set of religious principles from 800 years earlier. That's interesting. That's interesting how they do that. So, for instance, you've got manucipium, where you're if you're buying land. Still, when the Romans bought land right up until the time of Cicero, you still had 3 people stand in a field, one of them with scales, one of them with a handful of dirt, and someone else, no doubt, with a bit of cash. And it all had to be performed with strict ritualed words. Well, that goes all the way back. But they're trying to fit, for instance, partnerships and companies. So as they're developing Asia Minor, and the equites are getting involved in how you exploit its resources. One of its resources, of course, being the tax revenue of the people of Asia Minor. You're having to devise what we would recognise as corporate structures, but do so in that. That's the bit I found the most interesting about Roman law, mate. How about you?
Right. Well, it's exciting. It's very exciting. I see that, for example, nowadays many businesses complain about over-regulation, whereas some businesses like sports is under-regulated. So it's fascinating how to combine this with what you're saying about the Roman law, but even more one step even further, I thought about this in the context of Russia, what they are doing right now. And even in times of peace, Russia is basically disregarding international law. And what's your view? What will happen to them? Are basically the fundamentals of rule of law at its crossroads right now? How do you feel?
The law goes out the window when war starts is, I suppose, right. I mean, to start with, all your conventions are going to end, aren't they? I mean, one would hope that there's a degree of control of action in war, but yeah, I mean, who's ever going to get hold of the actors to bring them to task? Yeah, look, it is what it is, mate. I can't really offer you any thoughts on that. It's yes, they're breaching, well, ignoring international standards, but yeah, absent dropping bombs on them, what's the alternative? They've now been sanctioned like you couldn't believe. There's not many more sanctions you can give. It reminds me when my youngest daughter, when she was about 14, she was just so much trouble, and it got to the point where I'd removed everything I could from her. And there was only so she couldn't use a phone, and she couldn't use the computer. Everything everything she'd been punished on. And I had one last thing, which was to watch a soap opera called EastEnders, and that was the last thing I had left as punishment. You can't watch EastEnders anymore. And I thought, if I do that, I've got nothing left. There's nothing left I can impose upon her, and she can do anything. So I never did it. But I don't know why that makes me think of Russia today, mate.
Sounds like my daughter. She's 15 now.
Oh man, it's hard age.
Yeah. Any other interesting stories from ancient Rome that seems to be relevant still today? How about Catiline? Do you remember the story? It's actually related to tax.
Catiline's related to tax. It's certainly related to elections and related to debt. And is it related? How's it related to tax?
Because actually, I read that this Catiline, when he rebelled against Cicero and tried to get into power, the information about this conspiracy came to Cicero and Senate from a tribe which came to the city to
Oh,
demand
yes, that's
tax
right.
exemption from
That's right.
Senate
That's right.
for
Yes,
this
you're right.
information. Yeah.
You're right. Well done, man. Oh, man.
Ah.
Have you just remembered that from school or something? Well, you must have looked it up. That's
No,
brilliant.
I did look it up
But you're right. You're right. That's how Cicero found out about it. So yeah. So I mean, that was that was the Roman system, and it's a system that Julius Caesar exploited. Was that you under the Republic, is that the cost of getting elected was incredibly high, and the big elections. So you went from Caesar was the first magistracy, and my thesis was all about the terms you used of these people and what that told you about where they fell in society. So it started with a Caesar. Then you could go on and hold what was called an aedileship, and they were the ones that held the public games, and they were really expensive, really expensive. Then there was praetor, basically ran the law courts, and then or tribunes. There was also another path up through tribune, and then there was a consul, and consul was super expensive. So what would happen to these young Romans who were politically motivated is they'd run up massive debts, and when the prize was to become consul, and the prize was to become consul at the age of 42. That was the perfect directed age. I haven't done this stuff for like 30 years, mate. And Catiline was part of a massive body, a large body of aspirant young hopefuls of good family who didn't make it. And Catiline lost because a guy called Murena won, and Murena got there allegedly through bribery, and Cicero successfully defended him of those charges. But yeah, so Catiline lost and was aggrieved on the basis that it had been achieved by evil means, and he was part of a large body in that position. So what they were, and so they'd missed the money. The money was to become consul. Then you raked it in. You paid off all your debtors. You made yourself a fortune. You went off into glorified retirement. And again, my thesis was about the terms you used of people in that glorified retirement and what that meant about them. Yeah, so then they decided, well, they were crushed by this debt, which was now unrelievable. So the answer is to get rid of the debt. So let's have a tabula rasa. Let's erase all of the debts, and that was their campaign. And it, like a lot of things in that last century of the Republic, it just ended in brutal warfare. If you think about it, you start with Marius and Sulla. You've then got what was his name, Licinius. Then you've got Catiline. Then you've got Saturninus is in there as well, isn't he? Then you've got Clodius Milo, Crassus, Pompey, Caesar. It's all just slashing people up with short swords. It's constantly one violent, and the social wars, of course, which is where that tribe came from. All of that, they're just cutting each other into ribbons. Yeah, and so that's the basis of it. But yeah, you're right. That's where he got the information. Well done.
Nothing happens without taxation, or at least some relation to that. But the irony of the whole story, I think, was the biggest irony of the whole story was, I think that Cicero was defender of rule of law, and there he was punishing Catiline for this without
Extrajudicially.
Yeah,
I mean,
without
that's what
court
got him.
order. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he claimed he was exercising the rule of law, but well, I wonder if that's a feature of your first question, because you had this concept called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which was a Senate direction that the consul or whoever received it could do what was necessary, and it was basically a blank check. So yeah, it was extrajudicial murders. I mean, there was a bunch of them. Catiline died in battle, with all the wounds in the front, I think Plutarch said. So, you know, he was no coward. But yeah, there was a whole bunch of them that Cicero just slit their throats in prison.
Right. Actually, one of the books I recommended you to read was this Quo Vadis.
Indeed.
It was my father who recommended it to me as the best book he's read. Um, and the Polish author Henryk Sienkiewicz got this Nobel Prize in Literature back in 1905 for accurate reflection of the ancient Rome. So any books that have left some marks on in your memories, what would you recommend to your listeners right now?
Well, to start with, Yanis, on your recommendation, I've bought that book, which I'm taking to France next week, and I'll be reading it while I'm out there. So there.
Right.
Also, you're talking to a 59-year-old guy, which means by definition, I'm in a book group with other 59-year-old guys. In fact, they're my former partners at Dorsey. So the best one we've read recently was, well, I'll give you two ideas. One is the best one we've read in a while, which is called All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. And that didn't get to the Nobel, but it got to the Pulitzer. That's an excellent book. It's about 600 pages or something. Oh, that's another thing about book groups with old lawyers. The number of pages is highly relevant.
Right.
And this was about 600 pages. And the reason I liked it so much, the language was great, but the story all came together in the last 3 pages. And suddenly it was like the curtain was open and you could see what was going on. And I thought, what an idiot am I? For 597 pages, I haven't realized any of this. So that was the best one we've read for a while. One I would recommend, I'd recommend this to everyone, is the Gough Whitlam autobiography of the Australian constitutional crisis of November 1974-5, called The Dismissal by Gough Whitlam, an excellent book. It's not to be read by those who find monarchies popular.
Right. Definitely, I'm intrigued. I will have a look at those.
Now, mate, if you wanted to fill up an hour with ease, I could tell you about the constitutional crisis in Australia in November 1975. I was just turning 13 at the time, and it was I can remember it like it was yesterday.
Right. Please do. Please do.
Oh. All right. So Australia now is very different from when I left. That's a feature, you know, when you leave a country, it doesn't stop changing. I have a mate who left Australia left Italy in the 50s, and when he goes back, everyone laughs at him because he speaks Italian from the 1950s. It's much more formal. So Australia from the Second World War was a very conservative government, and they were in power. Conservative government was in power for almost 30 years, and as it got into the 60s, Australian was changing like the rest of the world, and the Labor Party, or the left-wing party, sometimes referred to as more socialist, certainly more progressive, narrowly lost the election in 1969, and Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister. And for those of us who were, around 12 or 13 at the time, he was a very impressive guy. He was a powerful speaker. He was very articulate, and he was extremely funny. At one stage, a journalist, and he was very quick, a journalist caught him in the street once and said to him, "Mr. Whitlam, what do you think about abortion?" Which at that time was obviously a very hot topic, especially in Australia, which was a very conservative country. "What do you think about abortion?" And Gough Whitlam, without hesitating, turned to him and said, "Comrade, in your case, they should make it retrospective." So he was a quick guy, and yes, so he narrowly lost in 69 and then won in 72. We have lots of elections in Australia, 3-year terms. It's just, what is it in Latvia? What's the term there?
It's 4.
Right, okay, 3 years. 3 years gives you enough time to blame the last government. Then you've got 1 year to say, we're imposing a stringent budget because of all the damage of the previous government. And then you've got a last year to say, well, because of the work we've done over the previous 2 years, we can now give you all the money back. And then you go for another election. So that used to be the Australian cycle of elections. So 72, he got in. What then happened was the previous Conservative administration obviously tried to remove him, and they tried to remove him through abuses of the constitutional system, which resulted in them gaining a 1-seat majority in the upper house. And once they had the 1-seat majority in the upper house, they refused to pass any money bills. So the government couldn't get through its budget. It couldn't, Australia has an annual budget, I dare say, like everywhere else. And every year you must pass a new finance bill, otherwise you don't have the money to pay for public services. So they simply vetoed it by this 1-seat majority. Rather than allow that system to resolve itself in a political way, it was a political problem that should have had a political solution. Under the Australian Constitution, the Queen, through the Governor-General, had the ability to dissolve both houses of Parliament, which would only ever be exercised in the UK, and indeed anywhere else, and indeed in the Australia now. You could only ever exercise that with the at the direction of the government, the direction of the Prime Minister. You couldn't dissolve Parliament otherwise, but he did, and the Governor-General simply, at the instruction of the opposition, dissolved the Australian Parliament and put in the previous Conservative administration as a caretaker government. They then alleged that they'd found all sorts of wrongdoing now that they were in government, and out went maybe the only ever progressive Australian government. In the short period they were in power, they did all sorts of things: equal pay for women, land rights for Indigenous people. They gave independence to Papua New Guinea. There was, they got out of the Vietnam War. There's endless. It was, there were more big hits than they could put in the papers that they did in those days, but it didn't last long. So there you go. That's more than you wanted to know about November 1975.
That's very useful for those who are not following daily the Australian news. So I appreciate that.
Well, Danny, mate, that's almost 60 years ago. So let's not say it's daily.
Right. But you've achieved a lot in your life as a tax litigator. Any life principles or gurus that you follow?
Oh, Yanis, I did say don't ask me about philosophy. I'm not a particularly philosophical guy. I could tell you about stuff I've noticed about tax. Um, I mean, I was listening to your podcast with, who was it, Leonard Wagner, who you had from EY you had on, was very interesting. I'm not saying your other ones weren't either as well. I sort of listened to some of those. And yeah, he made the point that tax is often driven by perception, and because it's regarded as I think his point was because it's regarded as an area for experts, you can basically get away with anything because it just becomes, and yeah, I mean, two features that you see a lot that I think, and he was talking about the Unshell directive in that regard as well, as being driven by perception rather than reality or need. And I certainly don't see a great need for the Unshell directive, but there we are. And maybe a lot of member states won't either. One thing is that there's always a discussion about tax rate. Everything's about tax rate, but we all know that tax take is rate times base. And when a feature that I found from a number of my cases involved analysing the revenue from tax obtained by the UK from about 73 onwards. And a really stark feature is that as a percentage of GDP, corporation tax as part of tax revenue never actually changes. So back in 1973, corporation tax rate was 52%. Margaret Thatcher then in about the late 80s, I think 86, ended getting it down to about 35%. It's now at 19. Over that period, it's not changed in terms of the percentage of GDP because of tax base. Back in 52, when it was 52%, you had all of these wonderful reliefs. You had stock relief. Stock relief, you compared the amount of stock you had at the beginning and the end of the year, and you got a tax deduction for the value difference. So of course, if you bought a lot of stock on the last day of the year, you got this massive tax deduction. So it was 52%, but they didn't pay that. And you know, when they bring the rates down, you get rid of reliefs. So now in the UK, you have a limitation on the amount of losses you can use, for example. Yeah, that's one feature that, although it's regarded as an area for experts, it does seem rather basic that they're only looking at one part of an equation. You know, they look at the rate. No one asks about the base or indeed the result of the equation. Another thing that struck me from his discussion, and which I've noticed, is the poor pay more tax than the rich, which is not the way it's meant to be. So again, if you take the UK model, if you're the wealthier people are more likely to be self-employed. If you're employed, your employer pays 13.8% national insurance contribution, which is basically just more income tax. And so the end result is that if you're earning under 50,000 a year, you're paying tax about 55%. If at the top end, you're only paying like 54%, something like that. That's another thing that I was interested in his talk, and that's something that I've noticed as I've gone along, that they don't this idea of a progressive system where the biggest shoulders carry the biggest burden isn't actually true. What do you think?
I'm thinking a lot about this progressivity, and I think progressive tax rates are not fair. I think that those who are like those who have strength inside to do something extra, to do some learning, some stuff that the others are not doing and just watching telly, and I think they shouldn't be punished for that.
You're not a trickle-down guy, are you? Because we just tried that over here. It was an absolute disaster. Did you? You must have heard about that. We lost a government in like 2 months with the idea that if you cut the top rate of tax, it's going to benefit the economy.
Oh, of course, because look who's the majority.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I'm not. Yeah. All right. All right. I wouldn't agree with that, Yanis. I would have thought the biggest shoulder should carry the biggest burden, and you know, 55%.
But they are financially, like not by rates, but by the amount of money they are bringing.
Well, that was the position, wasn't it, of the French king before the French Revolution, as they had a reverse progressivity. So as you went up, you paid a lower rate of tax because you were providing more money.
Right.
That didn't. I suppose your point then holds, because it wasn't the aristocrats who won the French Revolution. It was those down below.
I realize that I'm minority here, but
well, don't you think that 50% for you and me is a lot easier than 50%, 55% for someone who's earning lower amounts, wouldn't you say?
I definitely wouldn't agree. Those who are having lower amounts should have a higher rate. Definitely not. But why not to have equal rate for all?
Okay. Well, I do remember when they increased my rate to 50%. It's now 54, but they increased my rate to 50% in 2008 as a result of the financial crisis, as a temporary measure. And I knew that that temporary 10%, I could see that becoming more and more attractive. And then 5 years later, they said I should have been happy that they reduced it to a permanent increase of 5%, which I was not happy about. But so, yes, I agree. And there must be, and there obviously is a level at which high tax damages the economy. And was it Machiavelli or someone that said at the start of an empire, the tax rates are low and the take is high, and at the end the tax rates are high and the take is low, which is exactly what happened in Rome back in the period we've just been talking about. The farming, as they called it, of tax revenues in the provinces was extremely lucrative, and people like Cicero's friend Atticus made vast fortunes out of it. By the end, 500 years later, by the end, people were being forced to raise tax revenues because the tax demand of the state. So this was the Decurion class. So what happened was, under the Republic, not assuming that all of your listeners, Yanis, are fully familiar with the taxation system of ancient Rome, but under the Republic, what you would do is the central government, so the consuls of the year, would determine what the tax take need to be from a certain area like Asia Minor, Asia Minor being the most lucrative, I think. And then bodies of businessmen would then bid for it. And they'd obviously take the biggest bidder. So if the tax take was 100 and you agreed to pay 110, then you'd win the bid. You would then go to Asia Minor and raise as much money as you could, because your profit was what you got over the 110. But by the time they got into the empire, that system ended, and they then went into a system where they identified a social class. And in Rome, social classes tended to have, well, they certainly had as a feature of them wealth bands. And the class they identified was called the Decurions. And what they did was to impose upon that class a requirement to provide from the area the tax revenues. And of course, it was the same system. You still tried to get as much money as you could, but there was no bidding anymore. And it was certainly, whereas you might have got 150 out of Asia Minor and made a profit of 40, the demand of central government, now the emperor, was going to be 300 or 400. So you had no chance, and it was just a burden. Why have I got into that? It's you've put me onto that. Your concept of anti-progressivity. That's how we got there.
Right. That people still don't learn 2,000 years after from the history.
Oh, does anyone ever learn from history? Does it ever actually repeat itself? It just looks similar, doesn't it?
Right.
I mean, yeah. Do you think anyone ever bothers with history, mate?
Some people do. Some wise people do.
Yeah. I have. You asked me about maxims. One maxim I have lived by is to learn from your mistakes. It's not a brilliant maxim, but it works really well. Don't make the same mistake twice. I told that to my current boss, Joe Hague, who said, no, the better maxim, Simon, is you learn from other people's mistakes. Yes, and that would be good. I can't say I've ever achieved that, but I have hoped I've learned from mine.
Right. That actually carries us nicely to another topic I want to talk about. Some 10 years ago, you established a firm which is boutique specializing on tax litigation, Joseph Hage Aaronson. And since then, I understand you have been on the top of the charts in every single year in be it Legal 500 or Chambers Europe as top litigation firm in UK. So tell about establishing the firm and the story behind it. How do you manage to keep this high standard?
Well, I should apologize for not have said it earlier, but congratulations on your award, mate.
Thanks.
Last time we met, you were just about to go off and get it. I and my team were at Dorsey for 10 years. Loved it there. It's a great firm to anyone thinking of a job with a US firm. What happened in the UK has a divided legal system. I'm not sure if it's the only place in the world that does. So you have barristers and solicitors. So you have two legal bodies of legal professionals. And at about that time, about 2013, they changed the rules. So barristers and solicitors could go into practice together. I'm a solicitor, and the main barrister I used on my cases was Graham Aaronson, KC, who has for many years been, sort of the leading light of tax litigators as barristers, and it just seemed absolutely logical that now it was permitted by regulation, we should form one practice. It never seemed a good sell to say to clients, I'm going to do the work, and there's also another guy I'm going to bring in who'll do the work, and yep, you'll get a bigger bill as a result. But that's the way the system works. It just sounded absolutely logical that we should be all in the same firm working as a team. Not saying that you can't work as a team with people in different firms. That does happen, but it just seemed the right thing to do. So we did. So that's the reason we left Dorsey, is because that opportunity was now available. So that's where the firm came from. Yeah, and well, the 3rd of March next year will be our 10th anniversary.
Great, congratulations! And how did you maintain such high standard all the time? I guess not easy to be on the top of the charts in UK.
Look, it's there's only one answer to that, Yanis, and you're going to see it coming, and it's actually true. It's the clients, isn't it? You know it. It's always the clients. It's the clients who have the ideas and the vision and the guts. I'm going into a trial in November next year, and I issued the claim form on the 18th of June 2003. So that will be over 20 years. That client has pursued that litigation. That's guts and commitment.
Wow.
And loyalty. It's the clients, where we genuinely serve and advise, and they genuinely decide and run. It's just I've been lucky to have the best clients around, and they become your friends, don't they? They do. I know they do, because when we met, you were talking to one of your clients, so they become friends.
But when I was at IFA in was it Mumbai, that I spoke to a guy from India, and he said, I asked, what's the average tax litigation time framework in India? He said 15 years, and now it sounds like you
I know.
I thought it's crazy, but it sounds like something like that happens in the UK as well.
Not usually. As I say, I used to be even more arrogant when I was younger, and I remember criticizing a client, criticizing another advisor for having taken far too long about a case, only to surpass that person's longevity by a long way. These are cases where you're challenging principles that affect tax revenue and are worth a lot of money. And if it's a matter of principle, and your opposition is not the revenue, your opposition is the government. The revenue just do, like me, they just do what they're told, and the government can pass laws, and it will. And the prospect of handing out tax revenue, which has already been gathered, is not attractive even to the opposition. The reason this case has lasted so long is it's been through every stage of the UK courts twice. It went to the ECJ 3 times, and in that process, legislation has been introduced that's impacted the claim with retrospective effect on, I don't know, about 5, 6 times. So you go to war with the government. You've got to have a lot of stamina and a lot of courage.
Right. Wow, it's impressive. And if it's not a secret, how is your tax litigation department functioning? Is it like everybody is handling their own clients, or do you somehow make subdivisions?
Well, it's a pretty collegiate approach. We all work on the same stuff. I mean, there are clients that are mine, but there's very few I work on just on my own. They tend to be the pro bono ones, mate, which I'll do on my own. But yeah, we all and we would always discuss cases. I mean, the best ideas come out of the discussions. The very best ideas are always. I'm sure you find this too, don't you? The very best ideas are a collective venture. They never. Few things, spring in full armor from the head of Zeus. That most things are the result of. Have, in my experience anyway, been the result of a lot of internal discussion.
I would quite agree, and we came to that conclusion, especially during COVID time, when there was we were missing this human interaction, and because of that, we started to have daily calls within the team each morning for at least for 5 or 10 minutes or so, just to catch up, and this gives some boost to some creating some ideas and
emails. And I've moved on to a system now, so I still work largely remotely, but I've moved on to a system where I try not to take any questions by email or always by telephone. Because it's that's from the team. Obviously, I'll take questions from the clients in whatever format they want to give them to me. But
sure.
But from the team, everything because that way you get a chance to discuss it. There's there's nothing lost in the
translation.
writing. Yeah, exactly. It's it's cheaper. Frankly, rather than have 10 emails flying backwards and forwards that take a day to reach a conclusion, you get to one in 5 minutes. So I agree. So I think more. My daughter works for a big multinational, and a US multinational, and they've just said that everyone now has to go into the office in the US. I think they reckon if they can make everyone go into the office in the US, the rest of the world will have to follow. And those of her age are saying, "Well, hang on, I'm working perfectly fine remotely."
Exactly.
But I'm not sure. I'm really not sure that it is as good, especially the more junior you get. Anyway, do I sound like I'm 59 years old? I think I do.
No, you don't.
Yeah, I do.
I think
I do, mate.
It's nowadays, I think it's a combination, because people want to see the other people, and just human interaction is
Sure.
in notwithstanding what age you are.
Yeah.
In tax litigation, do you see any IT advancements as well?
Oh man, yeah, it's taken off. Now that's a good thing that you'd agree with this, I'm sure. That's a good thing that's, if any, that's come out of lockdown. yeah, it's getting the dinosaurs, it's people like me, to realize you can use these facilities. I mean, how many times would you have done a call like this?
Right.
You know, before lockdown. It'd almost always be a meeting in person. But yeah, from my practice, the huge change, which is a massive benefit, is a reduction in paper. So for every court hearing, there's a bundle of documents, and the bundle of documents is never less than, well, you'd know this, it's never less than like 5 or 6 lever arch files, none of which anyone ever refers to. The only things they ever refer to are the stuff you didn't copy. You know, that's 5 or 6 bundles of files copied 15, 20 times. Now that's all electronic, and it's much better. It's much, in every sense, efficiency, you know, not chopping down several rainforests just for a tax case, all of that. I'm also a fan of the virtual hearings. There are some people who don't like them. They think they can't get at the witnesses as well virtually. But the number of cases like ours that turn on witness evidence are quite limited. And virtual hearings, again, they're cheaper. You know, you don't have to sit around in a courtroom waiting all day, and they're just as effective. So those were features of lockdown that, as I say, you know, we were, you know, those of us in the dinosaur brigade, you know, our claws were forced down on the fiery braille of the reality, and you know, we appreciated that it actually works, this stuff.
Right.
What do you think?
Of
What do
course,
you think?
yeah, definitely. I fully agree. And by the way, in the virtual hearings, we can even get the witnesses as well.
Yeah, no,
So
we do too. We do too. No, it's the people who fancy themselves as the rigorous cross-examiners who think that they need to sort of see them in the space in their face and feel the breath on their nose. Yeah, they say it's not as good. But yeah, as you know, I've not dealt with such a case over lockdown, but normal cases, it's fine. The witnesses are fine.
I've been dreaming in this area about some kind of platform, creating some kind of platform for those who either cannot afford uh, expensive lawyers for tax litigation. So they are either some poor people, but some important issue, or actually the amount of money is quite small. So the value of the dispute is quite small, but it is important for creating some kind of legitimate practice and some precedent. And for that reason, I thought that we need to help those guys to to litigate against the tax authorities, basically uh, by giving them some samples of documents to have either cheaper lawyer or do it on their own. What do you think about this?
Well, first thing, there's several features to that. One, yes, I mean, the UK may well is not the worst exponent of this, but money talks when it comes to going into court. And there are a lot of low-value cases which, even in tax, one immediately springs to mind is a case I read about a year ago, just a case report, that what had happened is it was personal tax. This woman had put in her tax return on time, had got a receipt. She'd done it online and had got a receipt from the revenue system that said it had been received. Intelligently, she printed out the receipt. What then happened was there was a bug in the revenue's computer system, and the return wasn't actually filed by the revenue until after the due date. So she got £100 fine. And that was fought all the way to the tribunal. And she fought it and she won it. And she won it because she had the receipt. Now, why someone along the way hadn't thought this is not one of the most meritorious cases to take, I don't know. But that's an example of what you're talking about. And that required a lot of perseverance. And you know yourself that going to court is a lot of work and trouble. There's no easy court hearing for anyone. So that's one of them. Another one of them is and that probably merits something like what you're talking about. Another one of them is basically consumer protection. So a tax impost which is, or a revenue practice which is inappropriate or simply not in accordance with the rules and impacts for a small amount of money on a very large amount of people. So it's never big enough for anyone to be particularly worried about, but it hits a lot of people. Now there are systems for that already. There are class actions, and the Americans have effectively privatized that sort of case by, so the American model, you would get a plaintiff firm of lawyers who took that on for a cut of the proceeds, and while there might be a hit of £10 each, if it hits, sufficient people and they take a third of it, the abuse of consumer rights is lost, so that it serves a public purpose, but people make money out of it. They're sort of utilizing greed to enforce a good consumer rights, and that's a particularly American approach. I wouldn't say I'm entirely against that. After that, mate, if you're talking about tax, you're talking about a proportion of your income. So unless you've done something really stupid, so you've ended up getting taxed 3 times on the same income, which can happen, and in fact you don't have to be too stupid for that to happen, do you? I mean, it can happen. It just falls in the same category as anything else. If you've got the money, if the money's worth it, you should be able to get a lawyer to pursue it. So I think it breaks up a bit. What do you think about privatizing consumer protection as they do in the States and extending that to tax? I wouldn't mind it.
Well, me either. I haven't thought about this. Definitely need to explore this further.
But I mean, if that poor woman with £100 fine had come to me, I'd just do it pro bono, just out of the offence, just out of pure moral indignation that someone would act that way.
Yeah, definitely. I think that yeah. I heard that in UK there are some charities related to that.
There are a number of charities. Yeah, I think they're advisory though. So they're helping people on their how to prepare tax returns or whatever.
That's another way.
Yeah, and they do excellent work.
That's great. In UK market, is there a typical fee arrangement for tax litigation? Is it like normally just based on hourly rates, or every law firm does it differently?
Now we're getting into what really interests you, Yadis, aren't we? You can have success fees. in the UK, so you can take a percentage of the damages, and there are limitations as to how that's done. So you can have a percentage of the damage, or you can have a system where you don't charge if you lose and you charge if you win, or you can have a system where you charge a little bit if you lose and a lot if you win. So the UK has, over the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, become a lot more liberal in the type of structures it will permit. I know from cases I have in other countries that that's not the case. How is it over there?
Well, we are quite restricted with success fee elements. We would base our calculations on our experience of the previous cases, but still the clients would normally demand some sort of fee estimations for yeah.
Of course they do. You know, and I feel it too. You know, when we are involved in litigation in a number of other jurisdictions where excellent local firms are running the litigation, and we're sort of providing some support for, particularly where it's a matter of EU law. And we've got cases like that in Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Germany. So you know, so I see it a bit from the client's perspective as well, and you know, the concept that it's impossible to quote for your fees. You know, you still hear people say that, but you know, I saw the reaction of a client to that once, which was, well, if it's impossible to quote, then that means you've never done it before. So why am I using you? If you've done it before, you can at least tell me what it cost last time, and don't tell me you can't come in on budget. We lay pipelines over terrain without even knowing what the soil condition is, and we have to come in within 10% of budget. So don't tell me your industry is immune. And that was you know, learning from your clients is also a useful
and they're
thing.
right. They're right.
And they're right. And they're right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree. We've covered a lot of tax-related stories.
And Australian constitutional history. Don't forget that.
Right. Anything, any other tax-related story in your mind? Maybe something related to I don't know, tax fraud.
Tax fraud. Well, I listened to your discussion on aggressive tax planning in one of your previous podcasts, and I agree with you. If you want me to add more to that, I can. The concept that, which, by the way, actually, I think that was also in the one with Leonard Wagner, coming up through the Dutch courts. So in the Lexell case, which was one we were involved, we had involvement in, the Lexell case. So that came out of Sweden and is about an additional interest deduction. So after you've passed an arm's length test on intra-group borrowing, the deduction for the interest, the Swedes then imposed an additional level of limitation. And the Dutch, in that case, had intervened to argue that the current case law on the tax avoidance justification should be changed to include the prevention of aggressive tax planning. And again, the same point that you made earlier, without actually defining what that means. And the Dutch Supreme Court have now referred to the ECJ a question on the Dutch provisions, which are the same as the Swedish ones in Lexell. My friends at Loans and Loaf were telling me all about that. And so that's interesting. So that, you know, that issue will now get to the ECJ in the context of an attempt to change the tax avoidance justification to include this nebulous concept of aggressive tax planning, which is undefined. You know, it's simply a buzzword, isn't it? It doesn't really get you anywhere. I often think, well, take for example, Langhorst Tohorst, an old case. So we have a German subsidiary of, I think, a Dutch parent company. German subsidiary is loss-making. It's in a terrible state. I think they made outboard motors or motorboats or something, and no one's buying their motorboats. And the German subsidiary is sinking. So the Dutch parent props it up, and it props it up with debt rather than equity. And they say, well, no, that's not arm's length, because this subsidiary is doing so badly that no bank would ever lend it any money, let alone, you know, so a loan would never actually arise. But there's nothing, that's an entirely commercial venture. I had another one. Again, this is what I'm saying is legitimate tax planning is fine, and the single market is all about finding the best place to do your business as cheaply as possible, and cheaply as possible includes tax, and we know that from Cadbury-Schweppes and other judgments that tax is relevant, is an expense you're legitimately take into account. So another example was the thin cap case that went to the ECJ. We won it in the ECJ and then lost it in the domestic courts. I really hate that. I really hate that's just that one really stings. So the group concerned, it was well, it was Lafarge. It's in the documents, so I can say. And it had done this massive transaction. It had bought Blue Circle. There's in fact 2 transactions. So to become this giant, this really valuable constructed building materials group, Blue Circle was the same size as Lafarge. It was UK parent, UK group. So they're basically doubling the size of the group. They should be allowed to do that. If their shareholders say, do that, there is we can make money out of that, that's a good economic move, then they should be permitted to do that. If you're buying something as big as yourself, by definition, you can't buy it with equity. You've got to borrow. So they borrowed from third-party banks, and they borrowed from third-party banks at top level. And why do you do that? Because you get the best deal. So they then acquire Blue Circle through funding a UK holding company, which then buys the group, which is obvious. And they fund it with debt. Why do they fund it with debt? Well, because what happens if Blue Circle makes a loss? If it makes a loss, you'll get a dividend block. I need, it's as big as my head. I've just swallowed something as big as my head. If it doesn't continue to give me the cash to fund the third-party borrowing, I'm in real trouble. And if it makes a loss, I can't get the money out because there'll be negative reserves and I can't get it out. So I have to lend it money. Now, why is that? What's wrong with that? That's entirely commercial. It makes eminent economic sense even to a Latin scholar like me. That makes good economic sense. You can't do it with equity. It has to be by debt. Is that aggressive tax planning? It's a lot of debt. It's creating a big interest deduction in the UK. But why would that be aggressive tax planning? If it is a commercial venture and it has and it is done in a way that is that minimizes tax, why is that aggressive? Why is that a problem? It should not be. So I thought your comments were correct, and I agree with them. And I'll do it to your face.
Well, I appreciate that. Marks and Spencer, you were representing client in that case.
Indeed.
That's quite famous case for the whole ECJ tax litigation history. Will you miss now the ECJ cases since UK
Of course
left?
Of course, yeah. And as
union?
You can tell, I still keep up to date on them. I try, and I still we still get involved now and then. Most of my cases in the UK are still EU law cases because Brexit only happened, well, it only took effect beginning of 2001, was it? 2001. Man, I'm getting old. 2020. Still going through the courts are all the pre-Brexit cases, and they'll still be going through the courts, I would have thought, for another 3 years. So, so I still practice EU law on a daily basis, and also we get involved in cases around the place. But of course, I hate the concept that we are no longer in the European concept. You know, my great-grandfather died on the Somme. My great-uncle died in the North Sea. I don't have those problems. I think too little, and it's a brilliant advertisement for capitalism. And I'm not even sure if it was intended. You say to countries like, you say to countries in jurisdictions that have poor human rights records, you can have access to a market of 650 million people, and you can do so on the same terms with no barriers. All you have to do is stop locking up your citizens extrajudicially, stop, capital punishment, stop coups, just observe some basic human rights and the following economic standards, and you can come in. And, how many is it now? It's down to 26, is it, with the UK becoming the first third country since South Sudan? It's a great concept, and I regret not being in it.
Right.
If you want to give me citizenship in Latvia, mate, I'm up for it.
No problem with that, Simon. You're always welcome here. On that note, I truly appreciate it. It's been a real joyride. We've covered a lot, the Roman law and different tax stories and tax litigation practice development. So I truly appreciate your time. It's been such a privilege to talk to you and listen to the stories you share. So thanks for that. And at the end, there's always the last question to all my guests about your version of meaning of life. What would you say to that?
I say to that the last thing you want to hear is a 59-year-old Australian lawyer telling you about the meaning of life. So I decline.
All right.
But look, thank you. I'm very flattered that you you thought that you offered this opportunity. So all the best to you and your practice, and thank you for this.
Thank you, Simon. It's been a privilege.